Imagine waking up tomorrow and finding out that someone had quietly taken a small percentage of everything in your wallet, your savings account, and your retirement fund without touching a single bill. No robbery, no fraud, no notice. Just gone. That is not a hypothetical nightmare. That is inflation. And it happens every single year to almost everyone in almost every country on earth. Most people think of inflation as a news story, a number announced by the government that makes groceries cost a little more. But inflation is far more insidious than that. It is a slow, compounding erosion of what your money can actually buy. A dollar today does not do the same job a dollar did 10 years ago. And 10 years from now, today's dollar will be worth even less. The shocking part is not that this happens. Economists expect it and governments plan for it. The shocking part is how invisible it feels until suddenly it does not. You do not notice inflation stealing your wealth the way you notice a thief. You notice it the way you notice getting older, gradually, then all at once. In the United States, the dollar has lost more than 96% of its purchasing power since the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913. That means something that cost $1 then would cost roughly $30 today. That is not a typo. And yet, most people keep large sums of money sitting in low interest accounts, quietly being eaten alive by this invisible tax. Before we talk about what to do about it, we need to understand exactly how it works and why it is so much stranger and more complicated than most people realize. At its core, inflation is simply the rate at which prices rise over time. But explaining why prices rise is where things get genuinely fascinating. There are three main drivers, and they operate very differently from each other. The first is demand pull inflation. This happens when too much money is chasing too few goods. Think of an economy where everyone suddenly has extra cash to spend. Businesses realize they can raise prices because people are willing to pay more. Supply cannot keep up with demand and prices climb. The second driver is cost push inflation. This one works from the other direction. When it costs more to produce something because raw materials get expensive, energy prices spike, or supply chains break down, businesses pass those costs along to consumers. You pay more not because you have more money, but because it now costs more to make the thing you are buying. The third driver is built in or wage price inflation, and it is arguably the trickiest. When workers expect prices to rise, they demand higher wages. When businesses pay higher wages, they raise prices to cover the extra cost, which makes workers demand even higher wages. It becomes a feedback loop. Now, here is the part that surprises most people. A small, stable amount of inflation is actually considered healthy. Central banks like the Federal Reserve in the US or the European Central Bank typically target an inflation rate of around 2% per year. The thinking is that mild inflation encourages spending and investment because holding cash becomes slightly costly. Deflation, falling prices, sounds nice but is actually dangerous because it causes people to delay purchases, which slows the entire economy. The problem is when inflation breaks out of that controlled range, which history shows it absolutely can. History is littered with cautionary tales about what happens when inflation spirals out of control, and some of them are almost impossible to believe. The most extreme version is called hyperinflation, and it does not just make things expensive, it obliterates entire economies and the lives of ordinary people along with them. The most documented case is Weimar Germany in the early 1920s. After World War I, Germany owed massive war reparations and began printing money to pay its debts. Prices doubled every few days. Workers were paid twice a day so they could spend their wages before the money lost its value by evening. People famously needed wheelbarrows full of banknotes just to buy bread. At the peak, the exchange rate reached 4.2 trillion German marks to $1. Savings that represented a lifetime of work became worthless in months. But Germany is not a historical outlier. Zimbabwe experienced hyperinflation in the late 2000s so severe that the government issued a $100 trillion bill, and it still was not worth much. More recently, Venezuela saw inflation exceed 1 million% in 2018, wiping out the savings of millions of ordinary citizens almost overnight. These extreme cases reveal something deeply important. Inflation is not just an economic phenomenon, it is a social and psychological one. When people lose faith in the value of money, trust collapses. Commerce breaks down, people resort to barter, entire class systems are reshuffled because those with debt can pay it off with worthless currency while those with savings watch their wealth evaporate. Hyperinflation is rare in developed economies, but it is a powerful reminder that money is ultimately a shared belief and beliefs can shatter. Here is something that rarely gets discussed in mainstream conversations about inflation. It does not affect everyone equally, and understanding this is crucial to understanding why inflation is such a politically and economically charged topic. Start with assets. People who own real estate, stocks, or businesses often fare relatively well during inflationary periods because the value of those assets tends to rise along with prices. Someone who owns a home sees its nominal value go up. Someone who holds shares in companies that can raise their prices also tends to see gains. But someone who holds mostly cash or keeps their savings in a low interest account gets crushed because the purchasing power of that cash steadily shrinks. This creates what economists call the inflation divide. Wealthier households who tend to hold more assets are often partially shielded. Lower income households who tend to hold more of their wealth as cash and spend a higher proportion of their income on necessities like food, energy, and rent feel inflation much more acutely. There is also the fixed income problem. Retirees or others living on a fixed income face a particularly brutal squeeze during high inflation periods. If your monthly income does not increase, but the cost of groceries, utilities, and healthcare does, your real standard of living drops, sometimes dramatically. Debt, interestingly, works the opposite way. Inflation is actually good for borrowers in one narrow sense. If you owe a fixed amount of money, that debt becomes easier to repay over time as the currency inflates. A mortgage taken out for $100,000 becomes relatively cheaper to service as wages and prices rise. This is why governments carrying large national debts sometimes have complicated relationships with inflation. A little inflation quietly reduces the real burden of that debt. So, what does all of this mean for you, practically speaking? The most important takeaway is that doing nothing is itself a financial decision, and often not a good one. Letting money sit in an account earning less interest than the rate of inflation means your purchasing power is shrinking in real terms, even as your account balance stays the same or nominally grows. This is one of the most common and costly misunderstandings in personal finance. People see a savings account earning 1% interest and think their money is safe. But if inflation is running at 3%, their real return is negative 2%. They are losing ground invisibly every year. History consistently shows that assets like broad stock market indices, real estate, and inflation linked bonds have tended to outpace inflation over long periods. This is not investment advice. Everyone's situation is different and involves real risk. But it is a factual observation about how purchasing power has been maintained or grown over decades. The psychology of inflation is also worth noting. Because inflation is gradual, our brains do not register it as a threat the way we register an immediate loss. This is related to a broader human tendency to weight present concerns more heavily than future ones. We feel the sting of today's high gas price, but we do not emotionally register the slow erosion of 10 years of savings. Making that invisible threat visible by actually calculating what inflation means for your specific savings over time can be a powerful motivator. Money is not just numbers on a screen, it is stored time, stored labor, stored potential. Inflation is the force that drains that potential quietly and persistently. Understanding it is the first step to keeping more of what you earn. If this kind of deep dive into how money really works is useful to you, please like this video and subscribe. There is a lot more where this came from.